I call the General Assembly to order for the opening of the second part of its third session. And in doing so, I'm sure delegates will pardon me if I refer back and perhaps refer forward. It's nearly 4 years since the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. That man, the great war leader of the United Nations, played an outstanding part in the creation and inspiration of these United Nations. And the dominant thought of Roosevelt throughout that long, sustained struggle was world peace and world justice. And these two great principles, fellow delegates, cannot be separated. You cannot have permanent peace or a real peace unless it's based on justice, and those two ideas are basic to the United Nations Charter and our organisation. And the sincere support and sustained support of all the leaders of the nations. In the last few years, it's impossible to ignore the fact great difficulties have arisen. And we've often had suspicion and lack of cooperation. But I want to make this statement, and I think it's crystal clear, and I don't think it can be controverted, that these difficulties have not been caused by the United Nations. All these difficulties would have been far greater without the United Nations, because these United Nations in the Assembly, in the Security Council, in the Trusteeship Council, in the Social and Economic Council, and all the agencies, whether specialised or not, they do serve as a meeting ground for constant, sustained, unselfish, altruistic effort to solve problems through free discussion on the basis of the great principles set forth in the Charter. And the fact is that nearly all the difficulties of the United Nations have been caused by one thing. And what is it? Great power disagreement outside the United Nations and completely independent of the United Nations. And I say this further, and I think we should remember it in resuming our task that we left off at Paris, that in the 3 years of our existence, the United Nations has had very many notable achievements to its credit. Let me take one illustration only. I know there'll be differences of opinion about it from the point of view of the merits of the case, but it's undoubted that in the Palestine question, the United Nations has pointed the way towards a just, a stable solution and has averted war in this region. And in the absence of the United Nations, it's quite probable that a general war would have broken out. And I can't help thinking of the efforts of so many officers of the United Nations, the Special Commission, the mediating efforts of the United Nations, and the sacrifice of Count Bernadotte, and the great work continued in his tradition, which has met with great success, the work of Mr. Bunch. But the genuine observance of human rights throughout the world. I would say this to you, and say it with complete frankness, that the importance of the items on the agenda shows this, that the United Nations remains today the cornerstone of effective international action to maintain peace and security and to promote higher standards of welfare throughout the whole world. The Charter declares these principles of justice, crystallises the hopes and principles of international, and it should be the guide to one of the 58 nations represented here today. Every one of them has freely accepted the Charter and is bound by it. Each is pledged to observe its principles faithfully. And this Charter and this organisation are the primary instruments of international peace. The Charter provides, as you know, that all other obligations which individual nations or groups of nations may accept must be subordinate to, must be in accordance with those set forth in the Charter of the United Nations. And every representative here, therefore, is pledged to the view that the United Nations is the supreme international body. It alone can give a common impetus and purpose to the efforts for peace made throughout the whole world. And worldwide security, and surely that's our objective, can be found only in a worldwide organisation. And so I ask you, and I've got the right to ask of you as President, not to allow ourselves to be deflected from our purposes, deflected perhaps by the faint-hearted, perhaps by the cynical, perhaps by the mischievous. We've got to support, we're pledged to support, and we shall support the United Nations and its ideals. And the phrase I would like to use is the phrase of President Truman, and that is unfaltering support for the United Nations. Unfaltering, not casual, not intermittent, not lip service, but unfaltering, steady, permanent support for the United Nations and its objective. That should be our watchword. And in doing so, ladies and gentlemen, fellow delegates, what we shall be trying to achieve is simply this: the heartfelt desire of the ordinary man and woman everywhere. What do they desire? Not very much. Peace and justice and decent standards of living, for themselves perhaps, but mainly for their children. Surely they've got a right to that after 2 world wars, and we've got to help them to get it. The governments of the world, therefore, must keep faith with their peoples. The League of Nations failed to prevent the Second World War, not because of the League, but because certain governments in the world didn't support the League. And the peoples of the world will certainly support the leaders here today who strive to help the United Nations. And at all times, remember that their efforts must be devoted to the carrying into effect of 3 great objectives. First, international peace. Second, international justice. And third, international welfare.